Hello and welcome to this first in a series of lectures on Geoffrey Chaucer, and particularly on the Wife of Bath. This opening talk focuses on the meter and the poetry that Chaucer wrote in. So it's called Chaucer and the Birth of Iambic Pentameter. This is an important way to start our discussion of Chaucer because he was really responsible for fixing English as the language of literature in this part of the world, as opposed to writing in French or in Latin. And also, he's responsible for fixing iambic pentameter as the form of poetry that came to dominate in the centuries after him. So we can see this working in the general prologue that begins, "When that April with his shore suute, the drocht of March hath pierced to the roote, and bathed every vein, and switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour." Now, there was a time when people looked at this language and thought, is he writing iambic pentameter? Because the rhythm and the syllable counts didn't always seem to add up consistently to 10 syllables a line or 5 feet per line. And some people felt that maybe Chaucer wasn't firmly in control of what he was doing. But later, people started to realize that no, he did know what he was doing, and if we trust Chaucer, we can use iambic pentameter to understand how Middle English was pronounced. So you'll notice on some of those words that I was reading, I pronounced the E at the end. So when that April, okay, so obviously we don't have any on the end of April now, but we have an awful lot of silent E's in English that we wouldn't pronounce. Like if you look at the last word in the second line, root, like if we saw that spelled that way, we would just say root. Well, that messes up the syllable count sometimes. So one of the things that they realized was, look at the second line, and you see the word drochte, which is drought, so the dry period of March before the rains come in April. Well, because it's followed by a word that begins with a vowel, they run that together. So it's the drocht of March. In other words, they wouldn't put in an extra syllable there and say the drochte of March. It's the drocht of March, and you can feel the rhythm beginning to flow. So people might have thought, oh, his rhythms are a bit rough. Well, no, there are ways that they are kind of smoothed out. Just another couple details. If you skip down to the line, hath in the ram his half course run, that Y is something you want to keep an eye on because it indicates the past tense of a verb. So run is ran. And that's very similar if you know German, the GE that goes on the front of some verbs to indicate that it's a past tense. You know, just as in English we would put ED on the end, here they put Y at the beginning. So that's just a couple things to look out for as we move ahead. Now, if you think Chaucer's Middle English is difficult to read, I just like to put this up here to remind you that we could be reading Old English, which is an entirely different language, really. And so I hope by looking at this you'll realize that Chaucer's English looks quite familiar to our eyes. This is a hymn written in Old English, and even though it looks, you know, completely alien to us, if you look very closely, you can see some words that feel familiar. So, nu schulen hergen hefen rikeswerd med smekte and his modga thank. You know, can we make any sense of that? But if you look down just a little over halfway on the left-hand side, you'll see the word heaven, H-E-O-F-O-N. Or above that, he, the pronoun he, that's the same. If you follow the heaven line over, heaven de Hove, heilig, heilig is the word for holy. Okay, below, a couple lines down, you see the word after. At the very bottom on the right, you see almighty, allmächtig. Okay, and then one of my favorite words is right in the middle on the right-hand side, Bernum, which is, I think I have the translation here. You can see He erst sheop eelde Bernum. He first created for men's sons. And you go, oh, Bernum is sons. And for those of you living where I am right now in Northern Ireland, or if you're in Scotland, you would know the word bairn, a wee bairn, a baby. So that idea of there are all kinds of familiar paths running through English that we can track through Old English, through Middle English, combinations of German and French, all come together here. And if we look attentively at the language, we can recognize these things. So heaven de Hrofa, heaven as a roof. Heilig Schippend, holy creator. And notice that Schippend, we had Skeop a few lines up. Creator, the shaper, that's where we get sculptor. Someone who makes something out of things. And you go, oh, right. So I hope that this looks interesting to you and that Chaucer looks more familiar, much more familiar once you've seen this language. The other thing I want to point out about this is you'll notice that this is not an iambic pentameter. This is an Old English form of poetry that relied on alliteration. So look at that first line. Nischulen, Herigen, Hefenricus word. Herigen and Hefenricus both begin with H. Next line. Methodus Megte en is Moodgethank. M. Okay. Next line. W. Right. The policy was, with this kind of Old English verse, generally 4 beats per line and generally 2 or 3, I think occasionally 4, but mostly 2 or 3 alliterative words. And you think, well, what a weird form of poetry. Think of it this way. They didn't have rhyme, or they weren't using rhyme, which to us is making the ends of words sound alike, and we think that's really clever. They had their rhyme sound at the start of words. And you think, well, what's the difference? It's kind of arbitrary which way you do it. Alliteration can be just as entertaining and interesting as rhyme. They went for alliteration. Okay? So my point here being, look at the big change between this and Chaucer, where suddenly he decides that no, iambic pentameter in all its kind of sophisticated 10-syllable, different feet, all that patterning is now the way that literature is going to take shape. So we shift into experienza though non auctorite were in this world were richt enough to me. And you realize, oh, auctorite me. To speak of woe that is in marriage, for lording sith I 12 year was of age. So you get age, leva, fiva, be, degree, all, rhyming in couplets all the way down. And what's really entertaining is that sometimes throughout the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer will make reference to the old form of poetry. He's still aware that that kind of rough 4-beat meter and alliteration was the outgoing style, and you'll get characters talking about that way of writing poetry. For example, in The Knight's Tale, and you can imagine the knight being the kind of guy who would like that kind of rough and ready old-fashioned verse. So what you get here is the tournament scene in The Knight's Tale. There is no more to say, okay? There is no more to say but west and east. In go the spears full sadly in arrest. In goeth the sharp spore into the side. There seen men who can lust and who can ride. This is like a, cowboy story or something. There shivering shafts up on shield is thick. Did you hear that? This is an old kind of tale, and the shafts of their pikes are shivering as they bang into the shields, and you get that SH sound repeated 3 times across. He feeleth through the heart spoon the prick, up springing spears 20 foot on height. Okay, all that kind of alliteration. Look the next 2 lines down. The helms, that is the helmets, the helms they to hewen and to shred, HH. Okay, out breast the blood with stern streams red. Out comes the blood. So the thing is, it's in the sound of the poetry. It's still iambic pentameter. It's the new style, but Chaucer's weaving through that, the good old-fashioned Old English kind of heroic story in the sound of it. There's another moment when asked to tell a tale that the parson responds that as he's a southerner, and I think the implication is, as it still often is in stereotypes today, that the south of England is where all the sophistication lies because you're near London. He says, well, I'm a southerner. I don't know how to rum-ram rough. But trusteth well I am a southern man. I cannot jest rum-ram rough by letter. He says, I don't do that kind of alliteration stuff. What the parson is saying is he has no skill at creating the alliterative style of verse that had once been commonplace. So the implication is he's kind of moved on, and so has Chaucer. So we get the lovely lyrical sound of when the rapria with his sure suita the drocht of marcheth persa to the ruta. When the April showers, the sweet April showers come and pierce the plants to their roots with the water, eliminating the drought of March, and bathe at every vein and switch liqueur of which engendered is the flower. So giving that kind of rich, life-giving power to the plants. Thus we get springtime, and that's when people longen to go on pilgrimages. So we get that unstressed, stressed rhythm, okay? And bathe at every vein and switch liqueur of which virtue engendered is the flower. Now, sometimes Chaucer mixes up those beats in order to draw our attention to particular lines, but that's the framework, is 5 feet of iambs, unstressed, stressed, making 10 syllables. Okay, and that's what an iamb is, an unstressed, stressed beat. The line everybody uses to remember what iambic pentameter is about comes from Christopher Marlowe. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? Referring to Helen of Troy. That's just a classic line to keep in your head to remember that rhythm. It's interesting to think, what's the opposite of an iamb? If an iamb is a weak beat followed by a strong beat, the opposite is a trochee, strong beat followed by a weak beat. And trochees are more aggressive. Instead of, is this the face, you would get boom, 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 much more aggressive. So you need to practice with individual words to think, are they iambs or are they trochees? So what about the word today? That's an iamb, because you wouldn't say today. What about a retrial? Oh, could you hear it just even when I said it there? A retrial. Boom, boom. That's a trochee. A phone book. Phone book. That's where the stress comes, is on the first syllable. It's also a trochee. Dispose. Will you please dispose of this? Dispose. That's the heavy beat. That's an iamb. Homer Simpson. 2 trochees. Okay. Maggie Simpson. 2 trochees. If you have a 2-syllable name yourself, try it with yours. If you're a Siobhan, it's an iamb. Okay. If you're a Deirdre, it's a trochee. So, why does any of this matter? Well, just as we heard in the Knight's Tale, with the rum-ram roughing going on there, with the swords and the shivering and all this kind of stuff, that sound of language communicates the meaning to a large extent. So Robert Frost, the great American poet, talked about this. He said, you know, there's a sound of sense. There's meaning in the rhythm. He says, what do we get in life and miss so often in literature? But the sentence sounds that underlie the words. Words themselves don't convey meaning. And to prove this, let us take the example of 2 people who are talking on the other side of a closed door, whose voices can be heard, but whose words cannot be distinguished. Even though the words do not carry, the sound of them does, and the listener can catch the meaning of the conversation. So through a door, can't hear the words, but you can hear the rhythm. To me, a sentence is not interesting merely in conveying a meaning of words. It must do something more. It must convey a meaning by sound. So if you hear somebody on the other side of a door, you know, a couple speaking to another, you just feel, oh, they're having an argument. I don't know what about, but I get the meaning. I know they're angry, okay? And Frost thinks that's key to poetry. So we have to listen to the rhythm of the language when we read Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton. So that iambic pattern, gadung, 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 is like a grid against which the rhythms shift and move. So when it deviates from iambic pentameter, you know something's up, like in The Knight's Tale, where suddenly all that alliteration is kind of pounding through the beat, and you realize, oh, this is a much more old-fashioned kind of sound. So good verse breaks that doggerel, the regularity of the metrical norm. There's both the meter and the expressiveness on it, and so we get a poem. So you wouldn't want just iambic pentameter. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? I think it is, so I will start to write some lines in which the meter is all right. It all will be just like it ought to be. I'll stop, for I have lost the will to live. You'll notice Shakespeare doesn't sound like that. Gadum, gadum, gadum. No, in come some variations, right? So Frost says, you give me the iambic, and I'll provide the variety in relation to it. Okay, so Hamlet, for example, he doesn't go da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. He says, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. Look at that too, and then the repetition, too. That's not ga-dum, okay, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Thaw and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Here comes another repetition. Oh, God, God. So if you heard that through a door, you'd know, wow, he's really upset, because it's in the rhythm, okay? If you want to think more about this rhythm and get some practice, there's a great video of the people with the I'm trying to remember, it's the Royal Shakespeare Company, working with children and introducing them to iambic pentameter and getting them thinking about the rhythm of language. So you can go have a look at that video on YouTube called Teaching Shakespeare, Introducing Iambic Pentameter. So thanks for joining me in learning about the history and purpose of iambic pentameter, particularly as it relates to Chaucer and the transition from Old English language to Middle English language, and from Old English metrical form to the kind of the rise of the iambic pentameter and heroic couplet form. And I will see you in the next lecture on Chaucer. Thank you.